Thank you very much for asking me to participate, and congratulations, Rania, on this very important work. I was going to make just three remarks: one on efficiency, one on effectiveness, and one on the multi-stakeholder issue. On efficiency, I guess I've been around in the development business now for a long time, so I can remember the history of thinking around donor coordination, harmonization, and multi-stakeholder work. And, when I was at DFID, the big thing was the Paris harmonization agenda and how do we get donors to coordinate among themselves. And then when I was at the World Bank about 20 years ago, the big thing was what was called then the Comprehensive Development Framework. I don't know if any of you remember that particular piece of development jargon, where there was an attempt to do a mapping like has been proposed here, but not nearly so comprehensive or transparent. But again, it was a little bit about donors coordinating themselves. And I think what's distinctive about the work that Rania has presented is that it is being done by the country for its own development purposes, and mapping donors into its framework and its objective. And it is a good manifestation of real ownership and being led by a country for its own strategy. So it's just good to remind ourselves how far we have come in the discussion around multi-stakeholder partnerships and economic diplomacy. I think the second point I think I'd make is that the mapping exercise is incredibly useful for aid effectiveness. I mean, there are still huge perceptions out there that aid money is wasted, that multilateral development banks aren't effective, that government spending is wasteful. And this mapping is key, not just for showing the efficiency of resource use, but also its effectiveness. Because when you do the mapping, you can see where the gaps are, which SDGs are not being met, which parts of the country are not being served. And in many ways, identifying those gaps is the most important thing. One of the things about the SDGs is that we know that, for example, SDGs that are based on measuring inputs, like how many kids you get into school, are much easier to deliver than SDGs that are defined as delivering outcomes, like reduced maternal mortality or improvements in literacy and educational outcomes. And the mapping that's been presented here is a way into that question of effectiveness and development effectiveness, and enables one to identify where we're falling short and where we need to do more work. We've done, actually, funnily enough, a similar exercise at the London School of Economics and mapped LSE's own research against the SDGs to see where we're falling short and which areas of research have been relatively neglected and where we need to do more. So it is a really good discipline to make sure that we are being comprehensive in our approach. And then finally, I think this approach really brings home the idea that no problem can be solved by one actor. And governments can't do it alone, the private sector can't do it alone, civil society can't do it alone, multilaterals can't do it alone. And we've known that for a long time, and people have paid lip service to that for a long time, but we haven't really had a way to operationalize that and make that real. This recent pandemic brought this home so clearly. Countries didn't necessarily have the resources, or in many cases, the supply of vaccines and PPE to respond. Multilaterals might have been able to provide loans, but if the supply of materials wasn't there, the loans couldn't be used effectively. The private sector didn't necessarily have the supply chains it needed to deliver at pace. And so unless you brought those parties together regularly, there was no hope of making progress on the crisis. And increasingly, I think we have to see most of the big international challenges as ones that can only be solved by that sort of variable geometry of multilateralism. And finding mechanisms to make that variable geometry work is really difficult. And I think what we've seen here today is a really good example of how a really useful tool for making the complex geometry of international cooperation actually practical and effective and efficient. And so a very useful model for other countries to adopt, and hopefully one that contributes to Egypt's own development more effectively.